All right, Jim McCue and moi, Chris Unger. We're here at 10 of 8 on a Wednesday
Hmm.
morning on March 3rd, 2021. We've been doing a lot of these podcast recordings, but we
Hmm.
thought we would talk with one another about who the heck are we?
Truly.
Why are we doing this? Right? Maybe it'll be interesting, maybe not. We'll see. Um, But it's kind of a very unusual. I'm not sure unusual is the word, but I think it's in keeping with the podcast series. And then Jim will get into the next conversation here. But I think that the thing that Jim and I are trying to do is to connect people. Um, from my vantage point, many of us are doing everything we can to do the right things by our youth, by our students, people we know, our friends, our colleagues, teachers, administrators. We work in the school systems, in our community, partners. So I don't want to forget them who are in the nonprofits around the country, if not the for profits. Everybody's trying to figure out their way to like make a difference. And in with youth, whether it's in the K through 12 ecosystem or outside the K through 12 ecosystem, in many ways, a lot of the work has been transactional in the last 20, 30, 40 years. There's different programs that are being sold, curricula that are being sold. I'm a big project-based learning fellow. I believe in project-based learning. I would organize all learning around projects. I don't have an issue with that. I would also think about other things that are important to think about, like differentiated learning and all that kind of stuff. But, I think one of the things that it really comes down to, and I think is the point of this podcast series, is about finding one another and joining our arms together and engaging in this revolution together rather than in silos, and around building relationships with one another and knowing one another and then hearing it from one another. And then the podcast, not just ours, but many of them, has been a real inspiration for people when they're either on the run, like I know Jim likes to do. He's a big runner, people driving, doing work in the house, whatever it might be. But you find out that there are some really incredible people across the country and around the world who are doing some amazing and amazing things, and it inspires you. But here is the ultimate point. I know I'm waxing on here. This is what I typically do. I apologize, but you listen and you get inspired. But then the question that sometimes comes up is, well, okay, so that is great, but what do I do? What do I do right now? I'm in this circumstance. My kid, I mean, even as a parent, my kids are in the public school system. Yes, I see them not doing well. I see them not being able to pursue their interests and passions. Yes, all these things. But what do I do? Do I just drop, take them out? And then what do I do? So it causes lots of, I'm a teacher in a school system. I've been here 25 years. I don't like what's happening. What do I do? So it's a stretch, maybe, but the point of this podcast series, finally, in the end, I get to, is to kind of one, like hear about all these amazing people and what they're doing and why they're doing it. And instead of thinking about it as a transactional, what program can I buy? What curriculum can I put to use? How do I think about myself as someone who can do something and insert myself and do the right thing that is true to my perspective, my value system, and the thing that I think that can help people do that is to connect themselves with others who are also doing that, to find alliances, to reach out and connect with them, and not and be okay with saying I don't know exactly what to do, but I want to do something. But find some friends in helping you think about, oh, okay, well, did you think about this? Did you think about that? Why don't you join us? Why don't you do that? Or I know a school down the road that does this. And I guess it's all about hearing the stories of action, the stories of commitment, the stories of agency, and broadening that to educators, parents, others around the world, to so that they know that there are people around the world really trying to make an impact. And then if it aligns with your vision of possibilities and your value system, connect with them. So, long-winded introduction to Jim, who read a piece that I wrote in Getting Smart about
Yeah.
the Philadelphia schools.
Yeah.
What'd you do, Jim?
I read it and then reached out to you directly. I found you through the wonders of the internet, and thankfully we connected in late 2020. And we just started talking about the schools here in Philadelphia that are doing amazingly innovative work. And then we started talking to another colleague of ours and thinking about ways to not only think about season 2 of this podcast, but more importantly, address some of the concerns, some of the thoughts that you just expressed. And I was taking notes while you were going through. And I think we align with and on a lot of the trajectory of where education is going, somewhat of the stagnant nature that's been in existence for far too long. You mentioned this idea of purchased curriculum and pacing and guidance, and how education has become almost a canned clinical. You can find in the textbook, let's just go through each lesson plan, and each lesson, it's scaffolded in a way that there is no further exploration. There is no authentic connection with the material. What is material, if not for a truly place-based, community-centric, culturally specific type of educational experience? And so with that, it's caused, and among many other things, but a lack of autonomy in teachers, in feeling like they have a voice. All teachers get into the profession because they have a deep love and care for students. And it's understandable that over years that they have to be required to turn to what's been delivered for them, that there's a fall off between the passion, the commitment, and the expression of love that you see in classrooms. And we talked to Matt Coleman, who will highlight throughout this conversation, and others that we've been able to interview as perspective as to why we're doing season 2. But he emphasized that sometimes he walks into classrooms and then he walks into the hallway and it's a totally different place. You don't get a sense of the spirit, the cultural identity, the school manifesting itself as a lens through which students can explore. And so I know that, as you've mentioned, knowing one another is really critical right now. And touch is really important. And I don't just mean physical touch, I mean human connection. And so, Chris, you asked the question of how we got involved with each other. It was me taking a risk and saying, who is this Chris Unger guy? He wrote this beautiful article about Philadelphia schools. Oh, he happens to have a podcast. Oh, he happens to be on the forefront of connecting so many educators, and others in the space of education that kind of, and we know it to be true now, have almost a Venn diagram touch in this space. It could be private businesses, it could be nonprofit organizations, it could be education reformers like James Harris that we spoke to late last week, or others that have just taken on this really unique perspective to think about how do we turn the inspiration that we feel when we listen, when we watch this type of content, and develop a sense of urgency to illicit action. So that's how we got connected, Chris.
Yeah, yeah. So let's get into each other a little bit here, right? I think, in a nutshell, not to say I got it exactly right, but we want to broaden people's awareness of all the different activity and all the different people that are doing things across the country, so that you, or the world, and say you are not alone there. Gain some inspiration by the amazing things that many are doing, but also like connect with us.
Yeah.
Like email us, connect with us, have a conversation with us, and we'll connect you with this person and that person. Or if you hear or listen to somebody on a podcast, reach out to them, because I think of this as a civil rights movement, and I won't go into details here, but it's sort of like some people know and some don't, but that they, in the late 50s, early 60s, people would, in the civil rights movement in the South, would convene from time to time at a farm uh, called the Highlander Center in Tennessee, and they were coming to share strategies to in the civil rights movement, and then they would gain some support and guidance and feel camaraderie, and then go out and do the heavy work. And maybe I'm being a little too, I don't know, some people might not be friendly to this, to think of it as a revolution, but I will say this, and we'll come back to it, because I want to get into our stories. Yeah, the reality is that let's assume everybody's well-meaning and wanted to do the right thing,
Mm.
but the system has, by virtue of the policies and funding structures by which the educational ecosystem is constructed, has it's become like a factory, and it hasn't supported the development of communities focused on nurturing the potential of each person.
Mm.
I'll stop there.
Well, there are two things that really are salient to me in what you just said, and one is this being a civil rights movement, and when we think about the history of what that means, but purely definitionally, if that's a word, it's the rights of citizens to be politically engaged and socially free. We think about liberatory education as a means by which all students have the ability to express themselves in their pursuit of learning. So that's what I see in what you're talking about. And I want to be mindful that this idea is we are the hosts of this podcast, but we want this podcast to be reflective of every interviewee that we have on
Yeah,
this second
sure,
series and season.
for sure.
So
Yeah,
it's as you mentioned, we are all in this space to do what's best by students, and I think this goes to the second point that I thought was really captured the reason why we're coming together in the second season. There's no shortage of podcast material content that you can put in your ears or review as a video. But what we wanted to really inspire with this second season was I analogize it to a webinar that you might view during this time of quarantine, or a workshop, even if it's virtually. And I see this more as a workshop more than a webinar. A webinar, it's almost like a lecture that you're listening to. You can be as passive as you want. It might be a really great author or leader, but it's not as engaging as when you go into those small breakout rooms of a Zoom and you just get to work on the dilemma that you're focused on in your community, and you're sharing out and you're telling the stories, and then you come back together and you're talking about it as a large group, and then it happens to exist thereafter with that conversation. So I think you capturing the fact that we want this to inspire action is purely what inspires me in having conversations with those that we've had conversations with, and it's pushed them to think, and I think it allows for us to make those deeper connections.
yeah. I think that the first action I would recommend is to reach out to others and build your own relationships with others that can help you think about what you can do in the world. That the relationships are really important. But and one other comment, and then I'll get into our stories. Uh, I talk a lot. We talk a lot. Others talk a lot about the focus on how do we really support the development of our youth into becoming who they could who they want to be, how they want to be, what they want to do in the world, be engaged, actualize. There's a lot of words we can talk about, but there's another side to this, which I think is important to point out. Is I wanna also think about how we can create a better world. Uh, One Stone in Boise talks about creating leaders that can make a better world. And when I look around the world, when I look around our country, at the very least, I think there are a lot of things we could be doing far better than we are right now for every person and as a humanity. So it's not just how do I actualize this individual, but how am I actualizing this individual so that the total contribution from everyone creates a better humanity, which I think is sorely missing. But that's another.
There are a lot of actors in this space, and I think that pulse comes through conversation, obviously, but commitment of and an empowerment of each actor in the space of education. It's not a siloed process.
Yeah.
And that's something that we've heard from not only Sandeep in his work in India, but also, I mean, I mentioned James Harris already, the work that's being done by Tony Simmons in Minnesota, and Melissa at 5280. I mean, these are all processes where these folks came to education because they saw the need. They acted with such sense of urgency that I think that goes to what you're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's amazing that these places like Iowa Big and One Stone and the Tacoma schools, I could go on and on about all these various schools. I know Tri-County Early College, Charlotte Lab School, I go on and on, Latitude High School in Oakland. And, you know, I think there's a chasm between this small bubble of people who are on the on the leading edge of rethinking the design of teaching, learning, and schooling. This is, for those who don't know, I mean, Education Reimagined is a group, nonprofit, that has, is pushing forth the notion of learner-centered ecosystems or environments and schools. And so they have a map. If you go to their website, educationreimagined.org, I think it's education-reimagined.org. They have a website with a map that you can find all these different learning communities. But it's what the problem is, and I see this again and again. And when I teach the classes that I teach at Northeastern, and I mention these schools, 99.9% of educators, let alone the parents and others, recognize, they even know that these places exist. Like there's a school, Iowa Big, or a high school program, even better, in Cedar Rapids, where kids are not in classes and classrooms, and they're doing projects in the community, and they're learning about the world and what their interests and potential passions are by doing real world authentic projects so I think there's something really important to connecting and bridging the chasm between people who are, this sounds bad, but people who are in the trenches in schools and school systems, running K-8 systems or K-12 systems or high school systems. I mentioned Iowa Big because when I mention high school, I've said this a million times, everybody sees the same things: long hallways, lockers, one room after another with 25 to 30 students, teaching science, math, art, social studies, on a 6 or 7 period schedule. But if I say, well, you don't have to do school like that, everybody's like, well, what do you mean you don't have to do school like that? Is there another way to do school?
You honestly don't have time to look around. I talk to teachers in my current role today, and Just getting them together to collaborate, to plan, to think with enough breadth of like deep thought partnership and reflection beyond all of the responsibilities that are put on their plate. There is literally not enough time in the day to actualize the things that they're doing directly for their students, that it makes sense with the system in place as it is for a teacher in Philadelphia, in West Philadelphia, to not even know what's going on in North Philadelphia or
Yeah,
South
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Philadelphia.
yeah.
And
Right.
so that network effect is so crucially needed right now. And just having it's the time, the allowance to be able to become more exposed to that, because that's education, but also to be able to feel like it's actionable. You can hear that and say, okay, I'm not only listening to it, I'm hearing it, I'm connecting with this person, but we can do this in my school, in my classroom, with my families, with my students.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so let's get into our stories finally, because I keep meandering down different roads here. So when I first talked with you, and I think you sent me some information about you, I forget the details and so forth, but I read you spent some time. You were at High Tech High, which many not everybody, many people know of, is a very it's a great example actually. And I talk a lot about how Rob Reardon and Larry Rosenstock were at Cambridge Ridge and Latin, and they went to the school board, and the principal and the superintendent said, "We have a different idea for a school," and they're like, "Yeah, we're not going to do that idea. That's too crazy, right?" And so Larry Rosenstock somehow ended up in San Diego talking with some uh, people as part of the business roundtable there, and they were bemoaning the high school graduates they were getting and their skills and so forth. And they said, "Well, Larry, we want that school." uh, and now they've got, I don't know how many, is a network of at least 15, maybe 20, 23 different schools, high
Mm.
schools, middle schools, elementary schools in San Diego area that are wildly popular. It's just another example of, you know, two teachers who had a different idea for school, and the system saying, yeah, that's, we can't do that. Yeah,
Yeah,
go for it.
and you mentioned Rob Reardon, who I've only been able to know through conversations that he's had with our larger staff at High Tech High, but such a beautiful human. He speaks with
Yeah,
such passion that I
yeah,
think, as the story goes, before I even met or heard from him, he would often cry during one of his conversations with us because he's so passionate. And I believe it. Every time that I heard him speak, he delivers with such passion that it brings him to tears. And then
yeah,
obviously, Larry, and I've heard his story and been able to talk with him directly in early mornings when I would get there and he would be there, and truly inspirational. I mean,
yeah,
he lives out that mission of education as a means to make deep connections with students. And his story working in carpentry and connecting with students
yeah,
in Boston and then bringing that same philosophy to San
yeah,
Diego, it's inspiring. And you walk into his office and you could just walk through one wall and you could see part of his whole life mapped out on the wall. He
uh,
lives and breathes this
yeah,
educational philosophy. So he's deeply inspiring.
yeah, yeah. And if you want to learn more about that, a lot of the book Most Likely to Succeed and the movie Most Likely to Succeed is grounded and based on High Tech High. But it also reminds me of Ted Dintersmith. And we're going into
Mm,
other stories, so let's do it though. Ted Dintersmith, who's a venture capitalist by trade, who, I don't know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, started to also look at state of education, bemoaning it, and wanting to do a difference. And you can go. He ended up writing a book um, with Tony Wagner at Harvard um, about you know the tragedy of schools and what could be, and then he ended up writing a book called What Schools Could Be, and he's now got a website with a playlist of and then you have these are the stories that I'm mindful of. Trace Pickering, assistant superintendent in the Cedar Rapids School District. I mentioned Iowa before, but a Sean Cornally, teacher in the district, came to him and said, I've got an idea for a school. And, you know, unfortunately, in many cases, assistant superintendents and others would say, well, that's just too crazy. We don't want that idea. But here's a different story, right? It's gonna, instead of being told that that won't work here, Trace, you know, embraced the idea and said, let's co-create it. And this kind of harkens back to what you mentioned Matt's commentary we hosted last night with Matt. The conversation was that there's so much politics involved in all of this. Like, I'm the superintendent and I have to make sure that the trains run on time. I'm this, and so we have to cover this curriculum. We need to make sure that we do the state testing and our students do well. I have to make sure that certain amount of our AP offerings are made available to at least some, I would hope all, on and on and on, school principals, so forth and so on. Matt said something I really appreciated last night, which is there's the politics, but there's also the more important thing is, instead of getting to the infighting around politics, is what do you do to engage a community to revision and imagine what they really want for their youth and for their community. And instead of fighting in the political arena, James Harris mentioned this problem. He was on the school board in Oakland, and the politics can kill you. I mean, he even said so. I mean, it's a drain.
Yeah.
But maybe the place you really need to go is you go right to the community and build relationships with asking the right questions. Is this what we want for children? So going by Iowa Big, the way they started, I won't go into the details here. You can hear about it elsewhere. But, they had 20 or 30 community members spend a day at high school as a student. And they were like, yeah, we don't want this for our kids. But there's like a lot of these stories. I think this is really interesting. These are stories of action. These are stories of people who decided that they would go out on a limb and pursue something different. With my entrepreneurship hat on, because I teach around entrepreneurship, and I don't mean for profit or, how to make a business to make more money. I'm talking about social entrepreneurship here. Entrepreneurship, for the most part, in a nutshell, if I could be so bold as to say, is really thinking about what you would actually like to do, looking around for the opportunity to materialize that or manifest that, and then coalescing the resources and relationships to manifest the idea. That's it in a nutshell. And then figuring out, and this is really, really important, figuring out where you can plant the seed of an idea or a product or a program or a activity that is kind of a prototype of the possibilities. And when you start the prototype, so you build the initial prototype at a scale that is realistic, that you can actually do. And then you surface the outcomes so that people can see the value of it. So the example of this would be, the big picture schools in Rhode Island 25 years ago now. Dennis Lickley and Elliot Washer heard that the governor wanted to start, I think it was the governor or mayor of Providence, the governor of Rhode Island, mayor, said, wait, I want to create a vocational school for the kids who are dropping out in the Providence schools because they're not engaged in schooling. Well, there you go. There's your opening. Dennis Litkey and Elliot Wash were always thinking, well, we should have a school designed around students' interests and passions. And we should connect them with people who are doing those things in the community. And that's the best way we can support youth. So they go to the governor or the mayor, I think it was the governor, and they say, we have an idea for a school, but it's not like a typical vocational school like you think of vocational schools. And I think it was the governor, whoever said, okay, start it. And they were able to do what they did because they were a district unto themselves.
Mm.
So they had an idea, and I'm going to foreground this because I want people thinking about this as they think about the podcast series and all these other people. Because everybody that we're talking with in some ways has done this. They say, we want to create a different school that's completely designed around helping students explore their potential interests and passions by engaging in those interests and passions with others in the community. Well, how are we going to do that? And all of a sudden, they find out there's this opening to start a new school in Rhode Island. They go talk to the governor, and the governor says, good, but the opportunity is even greater because they figured out the conditions to grow this because they were a district in themselves. They weren't under this other district mandates. They had the freedom to create what they wanted to create. Anyway, the long story short, they created these initial, they call it the Met at the time. It was the Big Picture School. The initial Big Picture School started in Providence. And then as more and more people got wind of it and came to visit and wanted to start their own version of these across the country, they created a network and they created a mechanism by which they could assist and support other communities to build those versions of Big Picture schools in their own. Now there's over 60 of them across the country. A good friend of mine, Jeff Petty, in the Puget Sound area in Seattle, who was the original principal at the Highline Big Picture School, but also spent the last 15 years helping other districts and systems grow Big Picture schools in Northwest. So I actually think this is an important part, and maybe we can go into more detail in another podcast, but the point is that if you are someone and you're listening to these other podcast series or listen to this one right now, as you're driving down the road, if you feel compelled that you want to do something differently and you want to find a way to make a difference in your community or in the lives of youth or whatever population you're concerned yourself with, put the entrepreneurial mindset on, but don't do it in a vacuum. Reach out to me. I'll help you incubate. I've got a bunch of other friends and colleagues like Jim, and I got some friends down in Philly where Jim is as well. Mike Dunn, Matthew Downing, Janine Dunn, Julie Cook, who have, they are now actually trying to help create incubators or design studios for other educators to decide what they want to do. In fact, I think that's a movement that we're actually thinking about, is how to create a hub to connect everyone so that they can reach out to the people that will help them ideate what they can do and move into action, not necessarily alone, but in relationship and with the kind of support systems you need to actualize your personal energy and passion to make a difference. I actually think that in the end, this is just a mechanism. The podcast series is just a mechanism to broaden people's awareness that you don't have to keep doing what you do. You might be able to do something differently. And then if you want to go out on a limb, reach out to any of these people or us, and we'll help you incubate what the possibilities are.
Yeah. And I hear a lot of the call for, hey, these schools, these communities, these places in which we're empowering young people to create their own positive change, to identify for themselves what they want out of education, not schooling, as you've noted before, but education. And I'm reflective of sometimes information sharing, there's bottlenecks, and we've already discussed there's not enough time in the day, or you're just not aware. And so I'm mindful of what happens, because you can, just like you've announced here, Chris, is like, there are so many beautiful places in which authentic design has been supporting all students, all mentors in the students' lives, equitable opportunities for all students to succeed, And you could go and do a quick search. You could talk to you or me or all the people that you just mentioned. It still becomes siloed. And so how do we not only, how is it that you have to opt out of that experience of learning, exposure, collaboration instead of opting in? And that's what drives me in thinking about, similar to Matt Coleman and Vanessa, their work in continuous improvement, is like, how do you make it so much easier for network effects to become a daily practice where you are so ingrained in the conversation and so enriched by that experience that it's intoxicating. It's so hard to put down. And we have it happening in education reform circles all over the country, all over the world. But how is it falling on the ears, and how is it encouraging not only action, because it's so much harder to pick up a new routine than to drop an old habit or to just have it weave in organically, to make that change idea on a daily basis. Say, I'm going to try it and let's see if it works, you know?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it has to be on a daily basis. I just know
Yeah.
that there needs to be touch points. I mean, I think that in reality, all of us, I mean, this is probably a bad way to put it, but all of us have our day job in some ways. Like
Mm,
we're all, I am a teacher, I am a superintendent, I am a district leader, I am a parent. Where can I, what can I do? How can I do it? Where's the right place to start? I just think that the place to start is to learn as much as you know and become familiar with all these different designs, to tell you the
mm,
truth, through Education Reimagined, through other readings with what schools could be, getting inspiration from like some of Ken Robinson's
mm.
book, Creative Schools. But I guess the missing link that I'm trying, and I think we're trying to do with the podcast series, is to kind of say, the people who are doing this work are people. And if you're wanting assistance and support to do the work you want to do, or even begin to think about what you can do and how you can do it, email. Jim emailed me. Hey, I just read your, what are you up to? And I'm like, oh, I'm trying to start a revolution. And Jim's like, oh, revolution sounds great. I go, hey, you want to do it together? Oh yeah, okay. And here we are.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I will say, Chris, I mean, I know much of this is unknown to our audience, and I mean the personal side of this relationship. I mean, we've been working on this podcast. We've been talking to another colleague of ours, kind of like noodling on ideas, and we continue to have conversations as it relates to work. Uh, but you and I have become so close. I mean, you're such a trusted friend of mine now, that that's the beautiful thing in these relationships, is like you start in reaching out because you both have a common care for students. And maybe this addresses that political side of things, seeking common ground. But I truly care about you. You care about me. We talk on a daily basis. And that only reinforces the work that we're doing, because unless you have that trust, unless you have those critical conversations where you're holding me up, I'm holding you up, you're holding me accountable, when you're down, I'm there for you, and vice versa, it makes the work, you're more accountable to it. You're more likely to show up and be, not only show up, but feel prepared. And it's really hard to do that in this transactional world that we find ourselves in. Maybe it's the virtual element, but I've been enriched by this experience and thinking about the podcast, and what makes me happy with regard to it rolling out throughout the next month or two is just
Yeah.
being able to share that passion in our voices with those, and press others to do the same.
Yeah. I think that you should reach out to people to gain inspiration and ideas of how you can move forward. But the most valuable thing that you can do is to reach out to people and create your network of friends and colleagues that can assist and support you to pursue the difference you want to make and how do you want to make it? Because we do get stuck. We are fumbling around sometimes on how to do whatever it is we're trying to do, particularly like when we feel alone in our communities or alone in our schools or far away from all the other activity. Reality is now with Zoom, phone calls, video, whatever you want to use, we all can connect. We can all create these relationships with one another across the country and beyond. Reach out like Jim did to me, and then my invitation to Jim is for us to do some work together. So these relationships, these friendships, they may not be communicating on a daily basis like Jim and I do because we're working on this podcast series and beyond that. But these, knowing that other people you can reach out to and go to, having people you can confer with, really, really, really important as you do the work. And that harkens back to this notion of a Highlander Center. you know, you know, I'm in a rural town. Well, I'm going to connect with these other folks that are doing this work and gain some solace and gain some support and gain some rejuvenate my confidence to do something. There's a lot of wisdom out there right now with people who have undertaken this work. Let's access it and let's continue to inspire others to not be okay with the status quo.
Mm.
Even more better, if for them to imagine what they would really like to be doing to make a difference in education or beyond, and like let's find ways to reach out and connect yourself with these other people that can help you figure it out as you fumble along. I don't have the answers.
No.
I don't know how to do this.
Being willing to admit that you don't know is a powerful thing, and taking that first step, being comfortable in the discomfort, just sending that message or sending that outreach requires a lot of vulnerability. And maybe that's part of the initial conversation. Maybe you do it within your own inner circle at first, and then you move forward. Maybe it's talking about the frameworks by which you work in, so that you feel confident that you're doing it based on something empirically evident that has shown success. Sometimes we look to create action or change, but we don't know how to do it sometimes. And sometimes it's just being that trailblazer instead of thinking, God, my identity has been shaken so much by the last year. How do I now face that? And some of that facing is just stripping away that identity that you previously had and engaging in things in a new way.
I kind of want to be sure to mention our friend Kath Rays, who you were
Yeah.
referencing earlier. I think here's someone, a mother who pulled her two kids out of school to homeschool them because she didn't feel like the schooling was serving them around their interest in proclivities and and the potential of their thriving in
Their aptitudes. Yeah.
And so she created, and it's a longer story. She created workspace education, which was like a phenomenal idea. It was a very community-centered, oriented, like all about serving families and youth around the fruition and actualization of the students. I won't go into the details about this, but the reason I mentioned it is because as word got out and people found her, mothers, fathers, community members across the United States and beyond the world, they would reach out to her and say, "Hey, I want to create this here in my community." That is, she basically decided that where I could put my energy is in assisting and supporting people in their own communities to create their own workspaces. It's now called 100 Roads. So if you go to 100roads.org, you'll find her and this effort to support individuals in their local communities to reconstruct in their own vision, these community centered, community oriented, community supported learning environments that are all about actualizing youth. And so, it's funny. These people like somehow found out about her, reached out to her, and now she's supporting all these other. And so this points to the power of networks, which I think you were kind of referencing a little bit, Jim. Is it's one thing when you're going out on a limb and saying, I have a crazy idea, I want to try this. It's another to say, I want to create this thing or recreate this thing that's happening in like 50 other communities or 100 other communities or 100 different schools. And, I'm not the crazy person. These things exist across the country, around the world. And let me tell you the outcomes, like whether it's big picture schools or workspaces or whatever it is. But, one of the reasons to reach out to people too is so that when you go back to the ranch, your community, however you want to frame it, and you tell people, I've got this crazy idea that I want to do the X. They don't look at you with like a cyclops with a single eye or some wacko progressive and say, well, we're not going to do that. We'll say, or in some cases, they even say, we can't do that. And I said, well, there's 100 different schools like this across the country. Why can't you do that? Why can't we do that? So there's a network effect, I think you were saying. It's very, very important. You need to build alliances, relationships with these others so that when you go into your community and say, hey, why don't we think about doing X, Y, or Z so that it really benefits our youth, people aren't going to be pushed on you or push you back and say that's not doable or that's crazy, or you can bring that network with you. Well, it's happening in 50 other schools, or it's happening in the next state, or it's happening in 2 towns over. I don't know. There's a network effect that I think is really important. You need to build individual relationships, but you need to network like crazy so that when you begin to talk with others about some of these ideas about moving schooling forward, you're bringing your network with you. That's really important.
And that last piece is resonates most with me. Is like you're bringing your voice, your community. You're not acting as one person. You're bringing things to the attention of others, and with mindfulness that all of our actions, all of our behaviors, whether it's whatever it may be in the classroom with fellow staff members, maybe it's with colleagues that you just happen to connect with over the years, maybe in past chapters of your life, current ones, maybe anticipation of future. You're doing it with an idea that every action that you're making, everything that you're saying is for something a little bit more than yourself. Just like Kath and just like the many others that we've highlighted in this series, this second season, is thinking about their child, their student. We all have that one particular image in our head, and we're not acting on behalf of ourselves, but for the students that we're working with, because we are part of that community. We are one with them, It's not acting for, it's acting with.
Yeah. And I would say not only the network with people outside your community, but start talking with everybody and anyone inside of your community, because you need to find allies within your community as well, not just allies outside, but allies within. And then you can rummage up the courage to maybe do something differently. Well, Jim, I know we're at the hour here. We didn't actually get into our stories. We're going to have to do that another time.
Part two.
Yeah, part two, I guess. Another, one of our stories, and how to lead us to what we're doing. I was really interested in working with you because even though we haven't got into it too much, it's sort of like I see this amazing set of experiences as I see them about having worked at High Tech High is one thing, but then you were in the Bay Area, you were in Seattle, you were working in Mississippi, you're now in Philadelphia.
It's been a journey.
It's been a journey. You've been there, and I knew from the first conversation that you were really thinking about, where do I go to make a difference in the world? And I'm like, oh, okay, well, let's figure that out together.
And I'm still thinking about it all the time. Because
Yeah,
we, you constantly reflect. You think about the connections that you're making with people and where you are in your chapter in life. I know I'm using the book analogy a lot, but you've been a beautiful partner in thinking about those things, and there will always be those questions. And as long as you're tapping into that and going on those long walks and kind of looking around, you'll continue to push yourself to grow, but also really make deep connections with others.
yeah, it's really important. I
Yeah.
think the last thing I'd like to say here is, I don't know how long you may have been in education. Anyone listening to this, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, maybe you're not in education, maybe you're a parent, maybe you're a community member. But, I hope through this conversation and the podcast series and any that you begin to consider thinking about looking around, expanding your horizon, finding out where the leading edge is, who's doing that work. Look at gettingsmart.com, read that, look at Education Reimagined. Reach out to us. I have a website called youcanchangeeducation.org. We're going to be creating a website out of this podcast series where we'll probably be inputting a lot of resources and people you can connect with. But, ultimately, want to have you be inspired by the stories of these individuals who have gone out of their way to insert themselves to make a difference in the world and for communities and youth, and begin to posit, well, what do I really want to do? And then don't do that in a room by yourself.
Mm.
Start to think about people that you could reach out to and talk with that can help you think about that question and even harness the resources to start mobilizing yourself towards that vision of your own design of how you can insert yourself in relation with others to make the difference you really want to make.
Truly. And that's a great way to kind of end this part of our conversation. And it's a daily practice. It's something that you continuously iterate on. It won't always be perfect, but some of that is part of learning for us as well.
All right, cool.
Chris, it's been a wonderful chat this morning. I hope that our listeners, our viewers, learned a little bit more about what we're doing and why we're doing it for this season 2. And they'll be catching a lot of those conversations in the coming weeks. All right. Talk to you later.
Bye.